The air inside the grand concert hall was thick. It's a kind of heavy silence that only happens when hundreds of people are holding their breath at the same time. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a nervous one. The hall was massive, with high ceilings that disappeared into shadows and velvet curtains that looked like they had been hanging there for 100 years. In the center of it all sat a shiny, black grand piano, looking lonely under the bright spotlight. Seated behind a long table to the side of the stage were the judges. But everyone's eyes were on the man in the middle. This was Julian. He wasn't just a judge. He was a legend in the world of music. He had played in every major city in the world, won dozens of awards, and was known as a genius. But today, he didn't look like a genius. He looked bored. And worse, he looked angry. Julian sat with his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He kept checking his watch, tapping his foot on the floor, sighing loudly enough that the people in the front row could hear. He had been listening to young pianists play for 6 hours straight. To him, every single one of them had been disappointing. They played the notes correctly, sure, but he felt they had no soul. They were like robots, just pressing keys. He was tired, his coffee was cold, and his patience had completely run out. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, wishing the day was over. Then, the heavy wooden door at the back of the stage opened. The sound echoed through the quiet hall. A young woman walked out. She didn't stride out confidently like the previous contestants. She moved slowly, carefully. She was dressed in a simple, modest dress, and in her hand she held a long white cane. The moment the audience saw the cane, a quiet ripple of whispers moved through the room like a wave. People nudged each other. "Is she?" Someone whispered. "Yes, I think she is blind," came the reply. Julian sat up straighter. He stopped tapping his foot. He watched the girl walk toward the piano. It took her a long time to navigate the few steps up to the stage platform. She tapped her cane on the floor, click, 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 listening to the sound to make sure she wouldn't trip. It was painful to watch. It wasn't painful because she was clumsy, but because she was so vulnerable. The bright spotlight was meant to show off a performer's face. But for her, it was just a glare she couldn't see. When she finally reached the piano bench, she didn't sit down immediately. She ran her hand along the smooth wood of the piano, finding the keys, touching them gently to get her bearings. She seemed to be counting in her head, measuring the distance of the bench. It was a slow process. Every second that ticked by, Julian's face grew darker. To Julian, this wasn't a brave moment. It was an insult. He was a man who believed that music was about perfection, about precision, about visual beauty on stage. He couldn't understand how someone who couldn't see the music sheet, couldn't see the audience, and couldn't even see the keys properly, could possibly deserve to be on this stage. In his mind, the organizers must have let her pass as a joke, or maybe just out of pity. He thought they were wasting his valuable time with a feel-good story that had no place in a serious competition. He looked at the other judges and rolled his eyes. They looked back at him nervously, but nobody said anything. Julian was the boss here. He turned his microphone on, and the sharp feedback squeal made the audience jump. He didn't apologize. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, and stared right at the young woman. She couldn't see his glare, but she could feel the atmosphere in the room change. The air had gone from nervous to hostile. She stood by the piano, waiting for a signal to start, but the signal didn't come. Instead, she heard Julian's voice cutting through the silence. "Excuse me," Julian said. His voice was loud and cold, echoing off the walls. "We don't have all day here. If you are lost, there is an exit to your left." A few people in the audience gasped. It was a cruel thing to say. The young woman froze. She turned her head slightly in the direction of his voice, but she didn't look scared. She looked calm. "I know where I am, sir," she said softly. "I am just finding my place." Julian let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. He took a sip of his cold water and slammed the cup down on the table. "Finding your place?" he mocked. "Music is a visual art, young lady. It is about seeing the patterns, reading the score, watching the conductor. You are up there stumbling around in the dark. How do you expect to play a masterpiece if you can't even see the piano? The room was dead silent now. You could hear a pin drop. The audience was shocked by his rudeness, but nobody dared to speak up against the famous pianist. Julian sat there, a smirk playing on the corner of his lips. He was waiting for her to cry. He was waiting for her to apologize and walk off the stage so they could move on to the next person. But the girl didn't cry. She didn't move. She just stood there, her hands resting on the back of the bench, absorbing his insults. It was as if she had heard this kind of thing 1,000 times before. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling slowly, and turned her face, though not her eyes, which were hidden behind dark glasses, directly toward the sound of his cruelty. The tension in the room was at a breaking point. Julian leaned back, thinking he had one. He thought he had successfully scared her away. He adjusted his cufflinks, looking around the room as if to say, "Well, that's over." But the girl wasn't leaving. She slowly moved around the bench and sat down. She smoothed her dress, adjusted her posture, and placed her hands in her lap. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. Julian raised his eyebrows. "Are we waiting for something else?" He snapped. The girl spoke again, her voice a little stronger this time, cutting through the tension like a knife. "No, sir," she said. "I was just waiting for the noise to stop so I could hear the music." Julian's face turned red. He opened his mouth to say something, to scold her for her attitude. But before he could get a word out, she raised her hands and hovered them over the keys. The smirk on Julian's face faltered for a split second. He realized she wasn't going to back down. She was challenging him. The silence of the room suddenly felt dangerous, like the calm before a storm. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The blind girl versus the famous genius. The stage was set for something none of them would ever forget. Julian couldn't believe what he had just heard. The young woman's words hung in the air, waiting for the noise to stop. For a moment, the famous judge sat frozen, his mouth slightly open. He was used to people being afraid of him. He was used to contestants trembling, sweating, and apologizing to him the moment he raised his voice. But this girl was different. She was sitting with her back straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. And she had just told him, the great Julian, to be quiet. A flush of red rose up Julian's neck. He felt a hot spark of anger in his chest. He looked at the other judges, hoping to see them laughing or scolding the girl, but they were all silent. They were looking at their papers or staring at the floor, clearly uncomfortable. They knew Julian's temper, and nobody wanted to get in the way of it. The silence stretched on. But it wasn't peaceful anymore. It was a staring contest, although only one person could actually stare. Julian leaned forward, placing his elbows heavily on the table. The microphone picked up the sound of his breathing, which was deep and ragged. He wasn't going to let this go. He felt he needed to prove to everyone in the room that he was still in control, that he was the expert, and that she was just a misguided girl who didn't know her place. "You have quite an attitude for someone in your position," Julian said. His voice was low, but it carried across the hall like a threat. "Do you know who I am? Do you know how many musicians I have trained? I have forgotten more about music than you will ever learn." The young woman didn't flinch. She kept her face turned toward him. "I respect your career, sir," she said politely. "But today, I am here to play, not to argue." Julian let out a sharp, sarcastic laugh. "Play, that is what you call it?" He stood up from his chair. The movement was sudden, and a few people in the audience jumped. Julian walked to the front of the judge's table. He wanted to get closer to the stage, to loom over her. He wanted to use his height, his presence, and his authority to scare her. "Music is not just about making sounds with your fingers," Julian began, waving his hands dramatically as he lectured her. "Music is architecture. It is visual. When I play, I see the colors of the notes. I see the structure of the symphony. It is like painting a beautiful picture in the air." He paused, looking down at her with a look of pity that was actually quite cruel. "But you? You are in a black box. You have no canvas. You are just hitting keys hoping they sound right." The audience was beginning to murmur now. People were shifting in their seats. It was uncomfortable to watch a powerful man bully a blind girl. It felt wrong, but Julian didn't care. He was too wrapped up in his own ego. He felt he was teaching the world a lesson about standards. "You say you were waiting for the noise to stop," Julian continued, his voice getting louder. "But maybe you should stop listening to your own ego. Do you really think you can compete with sighted musicians? Do you think you can feel the subtle emotions of a piece like Clair de Lune or La Campanella? Those pieces require light. They require vision." The young woman took a slow, deep breath. She could feel the sweat on her palms, and she wiped them discreetly on her dress. Of course, his words hurt. He was attacking her dream, her life's work. He was telling her that her blindness made her art worthless. It was a painful thing to hear, especially from someone she had admired for years. But she knew that if she cried, or if she argued back, he would win. He wanted her to break. He wanted her to run away, so she chose her words carefully. "Sir," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I may not see the light of the moon or the sparkle of a bell, but I can feel the vibration of the moonlight. I can hear the ring of the bell. My eyes may be closed, but my heart is wide open. Music is not just something you see. It is something you feel, and I feel it more than anyone." Julian rolled his eyes so hard it looked like they might get stuck. He shook his head in disgust. "That is a nice speech for a movie," he sneered. "But this is reality. This is a serious competition. We are looking for a star, not a sob story." He turned his back on the stage and walked back to his seat, throwing himself into the chair. He picked up his pen and tapped it aggressively on his clipboard. Tap, 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 tap. The sound was annoying and rhythmic, meant to distract her. "Go ahead then," Julian barked. "Play your song. But I am warning you, if you miss one note, if you hesitate, if it sounds like anything less than perfection, I am stopping you. I will not waste the audience's time on a sympathy act. Do you understand?" The girl nodded slowly. "I understand." "I can't hear you," Julian snapped. "Yes, I understand," she said, louder this time. "Good. Because I am done being nice." Julian leaned back, crossing his arms again. He looked at his watch. "You have 3 minutes to change my mind. Starting now." The pressure in the room was immense. It felt like the air had been squeezed out of the hall. The audience was terrified. They wanted to cheer for the girl, to tell her to ignore the mean judge, but everyone was afraid of making a sound. It was just her and the piano against the world. The young woman reached out and found the keys. They were cool and smooth under her fingertips. She closed her eyes behind her dark glasses. She didn't need to see them. She knew every inch of this instrument. She knew how the wood smelled, how the pedals felt under her feet, and exactly how much pressure was needed to create a soft whisper or a thundering boom. Julian sat there, staring at her with a smug expression. He was convinced she would fail. He was waiting for that first mistake so he could wave his hand and have her escorted off the stage. He wanted to be right. He wanted to prove that talent without sight was impossible. He tapped his pen on the table again. Tap, tap, tap. He was trying to break her concentration. He was being petty, cruel, and unprofessional. The young woman heard the tapping. It was annoying, like a mosquito buzzing in her ear. But she didn't let it stop her. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the tense air of the concert hall. And she let it out slowly. She blocked out the sound of the pen. She blocked out the sound of Julian's breathing. She blocked out the vision of the hundreds of eyes staring at her. In her mind, the bright spotlight faded away. The judgmental faces disappeared. There was only the music. It was building up inside her, waiting to be released. She knew that this wasn't just about playing a song anymore. It was about dignity. It was about showing him and everyone else that just because she lived in darkness, it didn't mean she couldn't create light. She lifted her hands high above the keyboard. For a second, they hovered there, suspended in time. Julian leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, ready to pounce on the first error. The audience leaned forward in their seats. Holding their breath, the silence of the room was complete, waiting for the first note. The mocking was over. The moment of truth had arrived. The silence in the concert hall was so heavy that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone's shoulders. The young woman sat on the bench, her hands hovering over the keys, but she did not strike them yet. It felt like an hour had passed, though in reality, it was only a few seconds. The tension in the room was like a tight rubber band, ready to snap. Julian, still sitting behind his table, let out another loud sigh. He looked at his watch, then up at the ceiling, counting the tiles as if he were bored to death. He was trying to make a point. He wanted her to feel that she was wasting his time. He picked up his pen again and started tapping it against the side of his coffee mug. Clink, clink, clink. It was a sharp, annoying sound that echoed in the quiet space. He did this on purpose. It was a dirty trick, a way to throw her off balance. He wanted to see if she would lose her focus, if she would get scared and mess up. But the young woman didn't move a muscle. She sat perfectly still, her breathing slow and rhythmic. She couldn't see the smirk on Julian's face, but she could hear the tapping. It was irritating, like a fly buzzing near her ear. However, she had learned a long time ago how to ignore distractions. When you cannot see, your ears become your radar, but you also learn how to tune things out. She mentally turned down the volume of the pen tapping until it sounded like a distant raindrop. She took a moment to feel the energy of the room. To a blind person, a room full of people feels very different than an empty room. She could sense the hundreds of bodies shifting in their seats. She could smell the mix of expensive perfume, old wood, and the dusty scent of the velvet curtains. She could feel the waves of sympathy coming from the audience. They felt sorry for her. They had seen how mean Julian was, and they were on her side. But she didn't want their pity. Pity doesn't win competitions. Music does. She thought about what Julian had said to her. Asterisk music is visual. You are in a black box. The words stung, but they also lit a fire inside her chest. He thought that because her eyes didn't work, her world was empty. He thought she had no canvas to paint on. But he was wrong. Her canvas was the air around her. Her colors were the vibrations she felt in her fingertips. She saw the world through sound. Where he saw darkness, she saw a symphony of textures and tones. She shifted her feet on the pedals. She felt the cool metal of the sustained pedal under her shoe. This was her territory. This grand piano was her friend. She knew every scratch on its body, every slight unevenness of the keys. She had spent thousands of hours practicing, alone in small rooms, while others were out seeing the world. She had sacrificed everything for this moment. She wasn't about to let one arrogant man take that away from her. Julian stopped tapping his pen. He leaned forward, squinting his eyes, trying to read her expression. He expected to see fear. He expected to see her hands shaking. But what he saw surprised him. Her face was calm. Her jaw was set firm. She looked like a warrior before a battle, not a scared girl. This made him uneasy. He crossed his legs, swinging his foot nervously. Are we going to play a scale? Or perhaps Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star? He mumbled under his breath, just loud enough for the people nearby to hear. A few nervous chuckles came from the back, but most of the audience remained dead silent, angry at his behavior. The young woman ignored his muttering. She closed her eyes fully behind her dark glasses. In her mind, she wasn't in a concert hall anymore. She was imagining a piece of music that was incredibly difficult. It was a piece that required intense emotion, not just technical skill. It was a song that started soft and sad, like a whisper in the dark, but then grew into a storm of power and rage. She knew the song was the perfect response to his insults. It was a song about overcoming darkness. She began to visualize the notes. In her head, they weren't black dots on a white page. They were vivid, living things. The low notes were deep blues and purples, rumbling like thunder. The high notes were bright golds and silvers, shining like stars. She built the entire song in her mind, note by note, chord by chord, until it was crystal clear. She could hear it playing in her head as loud as if the orchestra were right there beside her. Her hands started to move, but not to strike the keys yet. They hovered, feeling the static electricity that seems to surround instruments before they are played. She was checking the distance, making sure her fingers were exactly where they needed to be. It was a millimeter-perfect measurement that she did by instinct. Julian was getting restless now. He checked his watch again. He looked at the producer in the back of the room and shrugged his shoulders, as if to say, "Get her off the stage."
Ow.
The air between the judge and the musician was electric with conflict. It was no longer just a piano recital. It was a test of wills. He was trying to bully her into quitting, and she was refusing to break. She took one last deep breath, filling her lungs with the stale air of the hall. She thought about all the time she had been told no in her life, all the schools that hesitated to accept her, all the teachers who said it would be too hard, all the people who looked at her with sadness instead of respect. She thought about the long, difficult road that led her to this bench. And then she thought about Julian's cruel, smirking face. The anger she felt wasn't hot or wild. It was cold and focused. She used that anger to sharpen her mind. She transformed her hurt into determination. She wasn't just playing for herself anymore. She was playing for everyone who had ever been underestimated. She was playing to prove that limitation is just a state of mind. She adjusted her posture, rolling her shoulders back to ensure her arms were loose and free. Her wrists were flexible, ready for the speed she was about to unleash. The silence of the room suddenly felt ready to break. The audience could sense something was coming. The mood in the hall shifted from awkwardness to anticipation. Even Julian stopped fidgeting. He could feel the change in the air, too. It was the feeling you get right before lightning strikes. She was ready. The noise, the insults, the tapping, the pity, it all faded away. There was only her and the instrument. She was no longer the blind girl in the chair. She was the master of the sound. Her fingers tensed for a fraction of a second, gathering the energy of her entire being, preparing to release it into the world. She wasn't going to play a song. She was going to speak her truth, and she was going to make sure Julian listened. Then it happened. The young woman brought her hands down on the keys. The sound that came out of the piano was not gentle. It was not the careful, hesitant plinking of a beginner. It was a roar. The first chord was so loud and so powerful that it seemed to shake the dust from the rafters of the old concert hall. It was like a door being kicked open or a crack of thunder on a quiet night. The audience flinched in surprise, and several people covered their ears for a split second. Julian, who had been taking a sip of his coffee, nearly choked. He slammed the cup down, spilling a little brown liquid onto the table, but he didn't even notice. His eyes went wide, staring at the stage in disbelief. The smirk that had been glued to his face vanished instantly. Wiped away by the sheer force of the music, the young woman didn't stop. She didn't pause to check if the judges were impressed. She launched into the piece with a speed and aggression that was frightening. Her fingers moved across the ivory keys like they were possessed by a demon. They were a blur of motion, flying up and down the keyboard. Hitting the notes with machine-like precision but with human emotion, the song she played was complex. A difficult classical piece that was full of rapid twists and turns. It required a strength in the fingers that most pianists took years to build. But she played it as if it were as easy as breathing. The music swelled and grew. It started with that thunderous opening, then dropped to a whisper-soft melody that made everyone lean in, only to explode again into a flurry of high-speed notes. Julian sat frozen in his chair. He knew this piece. He knew exactly how hard it was. He had played it himself many times, and he knew that to play it this fast, without making a single mistake, was nearly impossible for someone with their eyes glued to the sheet music. Yet here was a girl who couldn't see the keys at all, playing it better than he had heard in years. He watched her hands closely, looking for the trick, looking for the hesitation. He wanted to find a flaw, something to grab onto so he could say, "See? She made a mistake." But there were no flaws. Her fingers knew exactly where to go. They skipped from the low notes to the high notes effortlessly. She wasn't looking. She was feeling. It was as if her fingertips had eyes of their own. The music told a story. At first it was angry. It mirrored the way Julian had treated her. It was sharp and biting, fighting back against his insults. Then the melody changed. It became softer, sadder. It sounded like a person crying in the dark, begging to be understood. The audience was completely captivated. The earlier tension in the room was gone, replaced by a deep, haunting reverence. People who had been looking at their phones were now staring at the stage with their mouths open. Julian's heart began to beat faster. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, a mixture of fear and awe. He realized with a sinking feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. He had judged a book by its cover, and now the book was reading him. The arrogance he felt earlier started to crumble, replaced by the chilling realization that he was in the presence of a true master. He glanced at the other judges. They were all open-mouthed, staring at the girl, completely mesmerized. Even the cynical producer in the back had put down his clipboard. The song reached its climax. The young woman's whole body was moving now. She wasn't sitting stiffly anymore. She was swaying with the rhythm, her head tilted back, lost in the world of sound. She was hitting the keys with such force that the piano seemed to be groaning under the pressure. The sound filled every corner of the massive hall, bouncing off the walls, vibrating through the floorboards. It felt like the music was surrounding them, lifting them up out of their seats. Julian found himself holding his breath. He forgot about his coffee. He forgot about his ego. He forgot about being the expert. For the first time in years, he felt like a student. He was listening to the music, really listening, and he heard things in the melody he had never noticed before. She wasn't just playing the notes written on the page. She was adding layers of emotion that weren't there, pulling them from her own experience of darkness and light. He watched her face. It was peaceful, yet intense. She wasn't performing for the audience. She wasn't performing for him. She was performing for the music itself. She was pouring her soul into the instrument, and the instrument was singing it back to the room. It was the most honest thing Julian had ever seen. The tempo increased. It was a dizzying rush of notes, a waterfall of sound that seemed impossible to control. Her fingers were flying so fast they looked like a swarm of bees. The rhythm was frantic, desperate, and beautiful. Julian clenched his hands on the edge of the table. He was waiting for the crash, the moment where her hands would get tangled and the music would fall apart. But it never happened. She navigated the hardest section of the piece with a grace that was almost scary. Then, suddenly, the rushing stopped. She pulled her hands away from the keyboard for a brief second of total silence. The hall went dead quiet. Then she brought them down for the final sequence. It was slow, heavy, and booming chords that rang out like church bells. She struck the keys with authority. Bong, bong, bong. Each chord resonated deeply. Hanging in the air like heavy smoke, she struck the very last note and held it, letting the sound sustain until it faded into nothingness. Her hands remained on the keys, her head bowed slightly. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was as if time had stopped. For nearly 10 seconds, the only sound in the entire hall was the fading echo of the piano note. The audience was paralyzed. They didn't know whether to clap or to cry. They had just witnessed something miraculous. They had seen a blind girl destroy a famous pianist's prejudice with nothing but 88 keys. Julian sat there, staring at the young woman's back. He didn't clap. He didn't smile. He just sat there, feeling small. The red flush of anger that had been on his face earlier was gone, replaced by a pale shade of shock. He realized that he wasn't the king of this castle anymore. The music was the king, and this young woman was its queen. He looked down at his hands, which were trembling slightly, and he felt a deep sense of shame wash over him. He had mocked her blindness, but she had shown him that she could see more with her heart than he ever could with his eyes. The song had changed the room, but more importantly, it had changed him. The last note of the piano faded away, disappearing into the high ceiling of the concert hall like a ghost. For a few heartbeats, the room remained completely still. It was that magical kind of silence where nobody dares to move because they are afraid of breaking the spell. The air seemed to be vibrating with the memory of the music that had just filled the space. Then, suddenly, the spell broke. It started with one person in the back, Ron, older man, who let out a loud, breathless, "Wow." Then, like a dam breaking, the entire hall erupted. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was a roar. Hundreds of people jumped to their feet at the exact same time. The sound was deafening, a wave of crashing noise that washed over the stage. People were whistling, shouting "Bravo," and stomping their feet. Some were even wiping tears from their eyes, so moved by what they had heard that they couldn't control their emotions. The young woman sat on the bench, slightly hunched over, her chest heaving up and down. She was out of breath, as if she had just run a marathon. She couldn't see the standing ovation. She couldn't see the hundreds of smiling faces or the tears in the audience, but she could hear it. She could feel the floor shaking slightly from the stomping feet. And most of all, she could feel the energy. It was warm, it was loving, and it was full of respect. A small, tired smile appeared on her face. She knew she had done it. Julian sat frozen at the judge's table. His hands were still gripping the edge, his knuckles white. The coffee he had spilled earlier was soaking into his papers, but he didn't care. He looked up at the audience, stunned. He was used to applause. Sure, he heard it every night. But this was different. This wasn't applause for a celebrity. This was gratitude. The audience was thanking the girl for sharing something real with them. He looked back at the stage. The arrogance and the smirk were completely gone from his face now. In their place was a look of humility that nobody had ever seen on him before. He felt a strange tightness in his throat. For the first time in years, he felt small. He realized that while he had spent his career perfecting the technique of music, he had lost the soul of it. This girl, who lived in darkness, had more light in her music than he had gathered in a lifetime. Slowly, Julian pushed his chair back. The metal legs scraped loudly against the floor, but the noise was lost in the thunder of the crowd. He stood up. He didn't just stand to leave. He stood to join them. He began to clap. It was a slow, rhythmic clap at first, but then it got faster. He wasn't clapping because it was the polite thing to do. He was clapping because he was a musician, and he knew greatness when he heard it. The people sitting near him noticed. They stopped clapping for a second and looked at him in shock. Julian never stood for contestants. He never clapped for anyone. But there he was, clapping his hands together, his eyes fixed on the blind girl at the piano. Seeing him stand, the other judges quickly scrambled to their feet, not wanting to be left sitting. Soon, the entire front row was standing and cheering, but Julian wasn't satisfied just being at the table. He felt a strong pull, a need to be closer. He stepped out from behind the judges' table and walked toward the stage stairs. The spotlight operator followed him, shining the bright light on him as he climbed the steps. Julian walked onto the stage, the heavy thud of his shoes echoing over the noise of the crowd. When the audience saw him walking onto the stage, the cheering got even louder. They sensed that history was being made. The famous critic, the man who had mocked her only minutes ago, was approaching her. The young woman heard the footsteps approaching. She turned her head, her expression guarded. She wasn't sure if he was coming to stop her or to scold her again. She tightened her grip on the piano bench. Julian reached the piano. He stood next to her for a moment, looking down at the top of her head. Then he did something that shocked everyone. He didn't speak into the microphone. He didn't look at the audience. He simply dropped to one knee beside the bench, so he would be at her eye level. The crowd went quiet again, wanting to hear what he would say. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Julian reached out and gently took the young woman's hand. Her hands were cold and trembling slightly from the adrenaline. He held them firmly but kindly between both of his. "I was wrong," Julian said. His voice wasn't booming or arrogant anymore. It was quiet, raspy, and sincere. "I was so incredibly wrong." The girl tilted her head, listening intently. "I told you that music was visual," Julian continued, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "I told you that you couldn't see the beauty of the song. But I was the one who was blind. I looked at you with my eyes, but I didn't see you. You just showed me more music in 5 minutes than I have heard in 10 years. You have a vision that goes far beyond sight." He squeezed her hands gently. "I want to apologize to you, not just as a judge, but as a fellow musician. I behaved terribly. I insulted you, and you answered me with the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. You have humbled me today. Thank you. Da-da-da-da-da-da. The young woman's lower lip began to quiver. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the reality of the moment was sinking in. I just wanted you to listen, she whispered back, her voice breaking. I listened, Julian said softly, and I heard every note. He stood up, still holding her hand, and raised it high in the air toward the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice gaining strength, this is not just a contestant. This is a true artist. The crowd exploded again. This time, it was even louder than before. It was a roar of approval that seemed to shake the foundations of the building. They were cheering for the girl, but they were also cheering for Julian. They were cheering because, for a brief moment, they had watched a cruel man become human again. They had watched ego die and respect take its place. Julian helped the young woman stand up. She bowed deeply to the audience, clutching his hand for support. He didn't let go. He stood beside her, his head bowed in respect, letting her take the spotlight. He didn't try to share it. He knew this moment belonged to her. As the applause continued, Julian looked out at the dark hall. He realized that he would never listen to music the same way again. He would never judge a book by its cover. The girl had changed the room, yes. She had turned a place of judgment into a place of love. But she had also changed him. And as he stood there on the stage, clapping for her, he felt lighter than he had in years. The darkness he had carried in his own heart was gone, replaced by the light of her music.